Welcome to another broadcast of Philosophic Perspectives on the ArtistFirst Radio Network. All past shows are archived. Visit ArtistFirst.com. And now here he is, your host, Arthur D. Schwartz.
Why, hello everybody. Welcome back. You know, today is, I think, a very, very pertinent show, to say the least. With all the violence we have in the schools, I actually just did a little research online. 142 shootings since 2013. Isn't that mind-boggling? It's so sad. It's so disturbing. I think for any thoughtful American, it's a source of great concern. And of course, it always centers around the gun control issue. I will say this. I mean, I'm certainly a person who favors gun control. But the opponents who say, well, it's not the guns that kill people, it's the people who shoot the guns. I mean, to a degree, they certainly have a point. What drives somebody to do that? And, of course, a troubled young mind, in particular, which most of these cases are, of course. And so it's a very pertinent subject of something that's probably as serious a matter that we have in America today, I would say. So I'm really privileged tonight to have as my guest someone who's an expert in the field of violence. Ron Goldman, Ph.D., is a psychological researcher, speaker, and writer. His work includes hundreds of contacts with parents, children, and medical and mental health professionals. Dr. Goldman's publications have been endorsed by dozens of professionals in mental health, medicine, and social science. His writing has appeared in newspapers, parenting publications, symposia proceedings, textbooks, and medical journals, and he has participated in over 200 media interviews. And so it is really my honor to have as my guest Dr. Ron Goldman. So, Dr. Goldman, how are you?
I'm doing fine. I'm pleasure to be with you tonight.
Well, thank you for being here.
Yep.
You know, so why don't we begin by having you, describe, your work in the field of violence, or I should say the roots of violence, particularly in America, United States.
Sure.
And, so we can go from there.
Okay. Well, in an overview of our problem here in this country, one way to look at it is our homicide rate. And our rate of homicides per 100,000 is about 5 times that of European countries, 12 times that of Japan. We have a homicide about once every 15 seconds. Assaults are also very common, particularly on women. 1 out of 3 women will be assaulted by a partner. 1 out of 6 women will be raped. And our usual response to the problem of violence includes, for example, having more police on the street, having better intelligence, putting people in jail. And this only goes so far. It doesn't really get to the root of the problem. And so the questions that are relevant, in my view, are, for example, is violent behavior innate, or does it come from experience? Is there a way to prevent violent behavior? Now, of course, we have many contributing factors. You mentioned guns, of course, then there's media violence, there's social problems, and many more. I contend that these are secondary factors, and my focus here is on primary factors, the origins. And so what's an example of that? Well, I would say repressed anger is a very significant primary factor that can be triggered by secondary factors. And there's little public attention to the primary factors, and that's one reason I appreciate having this opportunity to speak with you and bring that attention to a very important problem.
Right. So what are some of these fundamental factors that you see, or fundamental triggers, you might say?
Well, when I speak about repressed anger, I mean, one consideration is when does something like that start? When is it first noticed? And there have been some very significant studies on infants, and they found, for example, that infants that have an angry temperament are more likely to exhibit aggressive behavior at age 8. There's another study that found that children at age 8 that exhibit aggressive behaviors are more likely to be aggressive through age 30. So this kind of research suggests to us very strongly that the seeds of violent behavior are sown as early as infancy. So then the question becomes, what makes infants angry? And infants have a whole range of feelings, and anger is a very significant one, of course. So there's a couple of perspectives we can look at. For example, there's animal studies, studies on monkeys, and, for example, in an animal laboratory, this goes back even to 1950s now, a researcher had he separated the monkey infants from their mothers and put them in separate cages shortly after birth. And so these monkey infants had their basic physical needs met. They could see and hear and smell other monkeys, but they couldn't have physical contact and not with the mother. And a very important thing happened there as a result of that separation of infant from mother, and that what happened was that these monkey infants, as they grew older, became violent and aggressive toward normally behaving monkeys. And if they later became mothers themselves, they were aggressive toward their own infants. And so the bottom line here is the separation disrupted the bond between the mother and the infant. And this violent behavior got passed on to the next generation. And researchers also found that there were changes in the brain neurology in connection with the changes in behavior. The violent monkeys had changes in their brain. So it tells us, for example, that experience can alter biology, and that's a significant evidence of how important the relationship is between the infant and the mother. And here's another example. Cross-cultural studies. A researcher took a look at anthropological literature, cultural studies of cultures around the world, and found there were practices in different cultures that could predict whether they would be peaceful or more violent. So, for example, if these cultures carried the baby on the mother's body throughout the day for the first year of life, those cultures tended to be peaceful. And that relationship held up with 80% of the cultures observed in the study. And then another variable they looked at was that what was the culture's attitude toward sexual experience, premarital sexual experience. And if the culture was accepting and supportive of premarital sexual experience, then that culture tended to be peaceful as opposed to being more violent. So the bottom line of this research showed that these two variables, cultural practices, baby carrying on the mother's body and acceptance of premarital sexual experience, those two factors could predict with 100% accuracy the peaceful or violent tendencies of cultures around the world in this study. So that's very significant. When pleasure is high, violence is low. We are designed for pleasure.
Okay, that's a lot there. Perhaps a Pandora's box, perhaps. Now, I'm curious. Let's take about the mother, who carries the baby close to her body for the first year. Okay, so what cultures in particular were those? Well, what countries? Do you know?
Well, they tended to be more tribal kinds of cultures. Mm-hmm. As cultures get more westernized and industrialized and get involved in technology, cultural practices change. And so, what we'll be talking about here is that when those cultural practices change, they don't necessarily meet the needs of infants, and they get passed on from one generation to the next. But this relationship, the mother-infant bond, is so important. it is the first and fundamental intimate relationship a person has. And there are decades of studies on this that show, for example, those infants with a secure attachment, as it's called in the literature, with the mother. A secure attachment is associated with better mental development, better social development. These infants, as they grow older, between the studies go from age 2 to age 5, they show that they're more sociable with their peers if they have a very close attachment to the mother. These infants also have more self-confidence and more empathy. And, of course, empathy is a very important factor in terms of its effect on whether someone is going to hurt somebody else. If one has low empathy, one is much more likely, of course, to bring pain to somebody else, and of course, in the most extreme case, to murder somebody else. So there's a lot of research behind this.
Right.
And what the research really concludes is that the relationship between the infant and the mother is a biological and emotional template for future relationships of that child.
Right. So, yeah, that's very interesting, and I think a lot of that we can certainly relate to and understand. But I think there is, I think it's pretty clear that there's a really fascinating line of thinking that comes from the fact that, as I suspected, that the cultures where the women were carrying their infants for the first year very close to the body all the time, and so the thing is, we want peace and we want nonviolence. At the same time, I'm not sure the right word to use. I don't think aggressive behavior is good, but I think in our culture we would laud competitive behavior, or trying to strive and peaceful competition. And there's probably sometimes a fine line between when peaceful competition morphs into something that's not that's violent, that's not peaceful. And so I think there's probably a question on a sociological basis where the challenge for humanity is to, of course, to be peaceful, compassionate, empathetic, but also the striving, there might be, is it possible that there can be too much, so that, for example, going back to the tribal societies, is that one of the reasons why they're tribal societies, because they have focused in on a very warm, nonviolent way of existence, but at the same time, I don't think, I'm certainly, I'm sure you're not suggesting that we resort to tribal behaviors.
No.
So, I'm just kind of pointing out that the elements involved that I think are quite fascinating.
It is a very complex issue, and there's no simple answer to this. But again, I return to the point that in our American attempt to try to deal with this problem, like, for example, I read about, the programs in schools, fine. Programs of teenagers, fine. I don't hear about much attention to the origins of repressed anger, which again go back to infancy. And so I'll return to that point. And here's some examples of what can disrupt the mother-infant bond. Separation, which I've referred to, is a significant one, certainly if it happens after birth. Unmet needs, these are biological and psychological for the infant, and sometimes, particularly the medical profession, tends to focus on biological needs and not so much sensitivity to psychological needs. So that's key. And then two more, there's maltreatment and trauma. And either of those can result in a chronic state in the child that would limit the child's social and emotional development and could lead to angry temperament, either repressed or or maybe on the surface and being very irritable toward a lot of kinds of experiences. So this secure bond with the mother and child is primary to the problem. And when it's disrupted, it can cause the anger and becomes a primary factor for likelihood of violence. And again, let's be clear that violent behavior is a small proportion of people. But when these kinds of factors are present, it tends to increase the proportion of people who may engage in violent behavior. But even if they don't engage in violent behavior, they could have other long-term behavioral, emotional, and neurological effects due to that disruption with the mother and the bond there.
Right.
So we can talk about some cultural practices that contribute to this.
That's definitely. Yeah.
We'll get really specific here. Things that disrupt the bond. And just as an introduction to this, I would say that many of us have experienced most of these practices, and many of us are not violent. So again, I'm not suggesting at all here that if you have the experience, you'll be violent. Just as a hypothetical example, these practices may increase the likelihood of violence from, for example, 5% to 20%. So in that hypothetical example, the overwhelming majority of people would not be violent, but still an increase from 5 to 20% is very significant, hypothetically now. So, and if you're a parent, that's a very difficult job. We all know. We do the best we can, and so we need to be compassionate with ourselves and recognize, we have our personal cultural limitations that affect our choices here. Okay, so let's get back to the specific practices, and we'll start with birth. Obviously, at the start of life here, or at least life outside the womb. And what we've done here is changed a natural event into a medically controlled event. So, for example, about 99% of births in this country take place in medical hospitals. And there, the standard procedures around birth can lead to interventions, and the interventions can lead to complications. And generally, there's very little regard for how these procedures and interventions affect the infant. But it can be very significant, including physical disruption and pain and associated psychological pain and even injury with some of these interventions. So mothers are also affected by these disruptions in the natural process of birth. And what's interesting is there is no study that proves that birth in a hospital is safer than having birth at home, for example, with a competent attendant. We tend to believe that what we do is the best thing, and having birth in hospitals is common again, but it's not necessarily safer. And here's an interesting statistic, and that is our rate of maternal mortality after birth. We rank 65th in the world in terms of maternal deaths per 100,000 births. So that's a lot of countries that are doing better than we are in terms of minimizing the threat to life of mothers during birth. So this happens because, again, doctors are trained to do the certain procedures. They're afraid of lawsuits. In the extreme case, they may want to get home for dinner. I mean, I can't say this is very common, but there's all kinds of personal factors that come into play and professional factors that come into play and leading to medical decisions to do certain things that interfere with the natural process. And as a result, unfortunately, it has negative effects on the child. And just briefly, one more point on this. There are studies that show that birth complications have been associated with violent behavior. And the study I have in mind is a study of 4,000 males from birth to age 18. And they found that those individuals that had records of birth complications were more likely to engage in violent behavior at age 18. Another one is that methods of suicide in the case where those individuals, did that. Their method of suicide was more likely to be associated with something related to the birth. So, for example, if they committed suicide by asphyxiation, they were more likely to have a birth complication that included breathing problems. If they had suicide by drug overdose, they were more likely to have a birth that was involved with drugs given to the mother.
I see.
And then there's cesarean birth, which used to be less than 5% several decades ago, and now we're talking about 1 out of 3 infants in this country is born cesarean, which results in potential complications and also separation of the infant from the mother, because the infant then goes to a neonatal intensive care very often after cesarean. There's a lot of factors here that affect the infant that aren't given much attention.
Okay. Actually, I had a thought that I'm afraid might have just escaped me. But when you were going on about these, the various interventions, and it just came to me. I was just wondering, though, because I know these studies can be very complex and there's many factors. In the case of mothers who have, problems that that occur during delivery, or during pregnancy, or how would you call it a birth that was? How did you phrase that? That it required intervention, and they traced the boys up to the age of 18, and they had various problems. So what's the term you used?
Birth complications.
For birth complications. Okay, birth complications. Okay, so here's the thing: is it possible that a lower economic strata has more? The mothers tend to have more birth complications.
No, I mean it's possible, but when they make these associations, they're very good about eliminating other variables, so that they can only look at the effect of a particular variable and see how, what influence that has. Otherwise, then anybody could say, well, it could have been this, that, or the other factor. But they gather that data in the process of the study, and then try to hold that equal, or so that they're only looking at the variable in question.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, so we're going to take a break shortly, but I just wanted to comment that it's just very, very interesting, and to me, what you're doing here is you're showing the elements of of violence. You're kind of breaking it down. You're showing, the earliest, most elemental factors in the beginnings of life, and of the child, and how they can surface later on, and. I do want to talk about the different cultural practices, but to me, what emerges is two possibilities. One is completely changing the practice, or the other is doing things to ameliorate, to compensate in some ways some of the Western behaviors that might be difficult to eradicate completely, but they can be modified. They can be ameliorated. With compensatory practices, but we can discuss that when we come back. There's a lot of other things I want to talk about, but we're going to take a break right now, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Stay tuned.
In Ethical Empowerment, Virtue Beyond the Paradigms, Arthur D. Schwartz presents an ethical theory that is a framework for evaluating moral conundrums that go beyond legalistic rulemaking, dogmatism, and preconditioned thinking. The book is as much an ethical framework for unconventional ideas as it is for staying with convention. Ethical Empowerment is a manifesto of non-doctrinaire perspective. Ultimately, the hypnotic thinking of ideology and dogmatism can only be overcome by returning to the true source and essence of morality, which is nothing less than universal love. Discover how the philosophically liberating approach of the ethical empowerment can be applied to the range of ethical, social, and political controversy. Read about a plan to eliminate all political parties. Entertain the possibility of an overhaul of the patent system and its replacement with a system that rewards inventors while eliminating monopolistic control of patents and technological suppression. Many other transformative ideas are discussed in the book, including issues related to the monetary system, real estate, scientific paradigms, and a rational approach to conspiracy theory. While ethical empowerment will challenge your mind to consider new perspectives, the ethical challenge is always to keep the diversity, depth, and breadth of perspective within the boundaries of love. Ethical Empowerment is available at Amazon.com and most online booksellers in both print and e-book editions.
When tornadoes raked the South, it was ham radio that was on the air, saving lives. As communities lay in ruins, it was the hams who let their families know their loved ones were safe. When the power and cell phones went out, the hams were there, helping rescuers get the message through. Wherever catastrophes strike, amateur radio is ready. Amateur radio works when other communications don't. Contact the ARRL, the National Association for Amateur Radio, on the web at emergencyradio.org. That's emergencyradio.org.
Thank you for joining us on Philosophic Perspectives. Let's get right back to it. Here's your host, Arthur D. Schwartz.
Hi, welcome back. I'm not sure if you introduced me, Scott.
I did. I did indeed.
Okay. I was talking with the guest. Well, I want to start, we're talking about a lot of specific elements, I like to call it, in terms of what Dr. Goldman is looking at in terms of, the very early causes of violence in infants and then going on into, adulthood and adolescence. And so I want him to also, bring up some of the some other particular factors. I mean, one very controversial one is circumcision. I know he's very involved in that particular area. But I also, for the second half of the show, I want to talk a lot about the cultural beliefs that contribute to the problem of violence. Which
Sure.
I know he did a lot of work on that as well.
We'll certainly get to that.
Yeah. So. Would you want to bring in circumcision right now?
I want to get to that, and I just want to say briefly something that's very simple and also very important, and that is that very often in this country, newborn infants are separated from their mothers, and what they do is they take the infants and put them in a nursery. So these infants are literally lying in a plastic box some distance away in another room from their mothers. And this has been going on for many decades. And the recent literature has been showing that this is not in the infant's best interest. But again, it's difficult for hospitals and doctors to change what they've been doing for decades. And this, they're human beings like the rest of us, and they get into patterns, and very often they consider the mother as the patient. And of course she is, but she's not the only patient. The infant is also, of course, needs the proper care. And infants who are separated from mothers are, even if they're not crying, I mean, they could be withdrawn because of the overwhelming shock and pain of being separated from the mother so early. So they're likely to be feeling some form of abandonment, resignation, trauma, grief, and yes, anger. All these feelings are possible and, again, are likely to be repressed because it's such an overwhelming, painful feeling for an infant, a newborn infant, to be separated from the mother. So to sum up the birth experience, I would say birth doesn't, in this country now, typically involves separation of the infant from the mother, unmet needs, maltreatment, and trauma due to, again, the interventions and complications that sometimes are not necessary. And these factors, as I said earlier, figure into disrupting the bond between the mother and infant. And just one more thing on hospitals is that there is no effective oversight and accountability of hospitals in terms of how they practice what they do. I mean, there are some surveys taken, but they don't get to the level of evaluating their treatment, for example, of newborn infants and evaluating hospital policies in this respect. So we're really dependent on trying to raise awareness among the public and others who may have some influence over medical practice and hospital policies to get them to change these things. But it's taking a long time, unfortunately. Okay, now we'll get to circumcision. Again, most American males have been circumcised. The rate is decreasing. It was at a peak of about 85% back in the late 60s. It's now around 55%. So it's coming down, but it's taken a long time. Now imagine yourself being forcefully restrained and having any part of your genitals cut off. That would be considered by most people to be an experience of a violent act, and that's typically how the infant experiences circumcision, as an act of violence. And of course, if they're not overdrugged from the mother's taking drugs during labor and delivery, the infants are more likely to be responsive, both vocally and behaviorally. And I witnessed a ritual circumcision, and the infant was screaming at the top of his lungs for over 20 minutes. It was very distressing to hear. So the studies on circumcision show that it causes extreme pain and trauma, behavioral and neurological changes, loss of an important body part, the foreskin, of course, reduced sexual pleasure, potential psychological problems, potential complications, and then there's a lot of unknown effects that haven't been studied, because we here in the United States have a strong bias to defend circumcision and keep looking for benefits or potential benefits. So again, if the researchers themselves are circumcised, they have a personal bias in favor of circumcision rather than questioning it or looking at potential adverse effects. So there's no proven benefit here from cutting off this natural body part. No national medical organization in the world recommends circumcision. And a growing number of men, with the internet, we have access to people who have all kinds of things to say about a lot of things, and we're learning, and actually there are some surveys taken, that a growing number of men are feeling angry about having been circumcised. So to refer to some of the things I said before, circumcision includes separation, unmet needs, maltreatment, and trauma. These are the factors, again, that contribute to disrupting the relationship between the mother and child. And so we haven't had studies that look at, how does circumcision status, if it's independently studied, how does that compare to relevance of violent behavior? We haven't looked at that, and I don't think in the United States, doing something like that takes political will, takes funding, and it's not something we're likely to have done anytime soon. But let me just put out something I've observed, and that is you can go on the internet and you can find a world map of where countries are in armed conflict. You can also find a world map about where circumcisions are common. They happen to be very similar in terms of regions of the world that are engaged in circumcision and armed conflict. Now, I'm not saying there's cause and effect, but I'm saying that raises the question of something we ought to be taking a closer look at.
That's very interesting. However, I would be interested in knowing more about the different regions. I just want to comment, so I'll give you my reaction, because this is a matter where I guess a lot of men will have a reaction. So personally, I can see where maybe circumcision is occurring today because, it's a long-standing tradition, of course, starting, in the Bible. And so, and perhaps perhaps there was a hygienic reason back in the olden days, before modern hygiene today, perhaps, and so therefore perhaps it was something that was necessary in the development of early man, but now at this point in time it no longer has any need, so it doesn't have to be perpetuated. So I'm certainly open to that as a possibility. But then we go to the other extreme where you mentioned, there's the guy, some men are angry now because they were circumcised. I mean, when you said that, I kind of chuckled silently to myself. Because I think it is laughable. I think the men who are angry because they were circumcised is most likely people who have other problems. Honestly, that's my reaction. Again, you said in the beginning, of course, just all these behaviors don't necessarily lead to violence. So I personally never felt angry about it, and so I don't think most men do. So I think it is important because sometimes we go looking for excuses, and as a matter of fact, sometimes in general, I like to make a strong argument. I believe that behaviors in life, even starting from infants, are what part of our humanity is really about overcoming them. And so I think in this particular case, with someone who's actually angry because he was circumcised, I don't think, to me, it doesn't ring genuine. I think it means that this person has some other issue. Having said that, I'm certainly open to the fact that a screaming child, an infant, is probably not a healthy thing emotionally, and perhaps it is something that could be reformed at this point in time. Is no longer necessary.
All right, I got a few responses to that.
Okay, sure.
One is the body remembers what the mind forgets. Mm-hmm. So what typically happens with trauma is the feelings, the memories, and the experiences get repressed because they're overwhelming, and that's our defense against and surviving trauma, whether it's early or later in life. So even though we don't remember the trauma or make conscious connections with it, the body remembers. And actually, there's clinical experience of people who have recovered the memory because their body was able to access the feelings through certain techniques. They were able to access the feelings and actually get in touch with these early feelings connected with circumcision and other things in infancy. Another point I would make, and then I did a survey on this, and one of the results of the survey among men was that the more they knew about circumcision, the more dissatisfied they were with being circumcised. So what happens in this culture is that this is a taboo subject. We don't talk about this, generally speaking. And a lot of men, clearly are uncomfortable with this subject, and that's not an accident. The discomfort is the tip of the iceberg, and below the surface there are stronger feelings there. But because we tend to avoid honest, personal, emotional expressions in connection with this subject, then it becomes a cultural myth that everything's okay. And one other thing is that a couple of reasons men may not talk about circumcision because if they've tried it, they don't get a serious response from people. Their feelings may be repressed, so we're not going to hear much from them. And again, the body remembers these feelings, so they may not have access to the kinds of things that they would have access if they, say, were in a therapeutic environment. So there's a lot of complex perspectives on this that contribute to practice of circumcision being perpetuated.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, I definitely can see why, circumcision is not like a common, tea time conversation. I mean, I don't think people just talk about circumcision. What do you want to talk today about? Let's talk about circumcision. Yeah. I mean, I don't. Sure. I think that it's not that it's talk. It's not. I don't think that's necessarily taboo. It's just good manners or whatever. But again, there's no question. I mean, I've seen it too. I mean, it's the baby just is screaming like crazy, and certainly, I certainly understand it. But there is, we go, and of course, the baby doesn't understand what's happening. But still, as adults, we have very painful things. Sometimes, of course, we have the benefit of understanding, but. I will say this about the body remembers everything. Well, the body remembers everything, but you know what? I don't think the infant, while the body might remember the pain, the infant has no understanding of what that was and never will. In other words, that's well before its ability to understand. The baby's to understand what actually was happening.
It's gut level for an infant. It's not about understanding. It's about
right. I know it's a pain emotional level. On the pain level, body physical level. I understand that. However, things like anger tend to be rooted, in my view, in a basis of belief. That one becomes angry again. You have a belief against something. It could happen at a very early age. It could be happening, while you're very small, when your children, your parents are talking to you and saying certain things, and so forth and so on. But anger usually is formed when there is a belief that is ingrained very deeply into the mind that creates antipathy towards something. And so, in the case of circumcision, it's transcends that. It's just this little infant is feeling incredible pain, no question. But the thing is, there's no belief about it, and so the idea is, I'm just wondering, I hear what you're saying. I definitely hear the correlation. I'm not really opposed to the idea of let's say doing away with circumcision. I haven't made up my mind, but I'm not necessarily opposed to it. But I do have a hard time thinking of that as a source of anger. Again, I can only, like you said, I can only go with my own experience.
We got a lot to talk about here.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I will say, for example, there are studies that show that infants' behavior changes after circumcision, and they're less. For example, they have more difficulty breastfeeding. They have more difficulty making eye contact with the mother. So there are some strong signs that circumcision contributes. Obviously it's unmet needs, maltreatment, and trauma as far as the infant's experience is concerned.
Right.
And so that, again, those are the contributing factors to disrupting their relationship, which is a core problem here.
Right.
So let's move along to.
Well, yeah, actually, Dr. Goldman. So I wanted I wanted to get that part of the conversation in because it was I think it's a fascinating subject and very interesting. But we're gonna have to take a final break, and then when we come back, I would like to talk about the cultural beliefs and values related to the whole issue. Okay. We'll be back shortly.
This is Arthur D. Schwartz. Beliefs and disbeliefs can be very powerful. Much like philosophy, hypnotism is concerned with belief. Hypnotherapy, a practical application of hypnotism, may largely be described as the practice of removing false beliefs that form mental blocks to success, to happiness, and to well-being. In my hypnotherapy and philosophical counseling practice, I combine my work in philosophy with hypnotism in order to clear mental blockages that can occur on both conscious and subconscious levels. A mental block may be conscious or subconscious and can be expressed, for example, in the form of anxiety, low self-esteem or low motivation, bad habits, tobacco habits, weight gain, low performance, and much more. If you are interested in using hypnosis and the power of the mind to overcome mental blocks and barriers that have emerged in your life, please feel free to give me a call at 617-964-4800 or visit www.integralhypnosis.com. That's INTEGRAL hypnosis.com.
Are you a person who enjoys intellectual social interaction and finds digging deeper into the nature of things, from big issues to everyday life, an important part of the pleasure of life? Social Philosophizers is a Boston area social club for those who desire intellectual socializing. It's a club for both singles and non-singles, and for anyone who finds intellectually mingling to be the best form of social mingling. The club offers a variety of interesting venues such as philosophical get-togethers in private venues, book discussions concerning literature and philosophy, topical discussions over brunch or dinner, guest speakers, theater, after-work mixers, even long philosophical ruminations along nature trails or city streets, and more. If you live in the greater Boston area or occasionally spend time in the area, you can choose a cost-effective membership level that's right for you. Basic membership is free. Find the link on Arthur's Philosophical Perspectives show page at ArtistFirst.com or just search SocialPhilosophizers.com. We hope you'll join Social Philosophizers today. That's SocialPhilosophizers.com. Thanks for joining us, everyone, on Philosophic Perspectives on the ArtistFirst Radio Network. Let's send it back to your host, Arthur D. Schwartz.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. I'm really having a wonderful, enjoyable discussion here with Dr. Ronald Goldman on the subject of violence and how the roots form at a very, very early age. It's very interesting. And what I'd like to do right now is to ask Dr. Goldman to discuss some of the cultural beliefs and values that in our society that are reflected by these forms of early behavior.
Okay, so this is what perpetuates or helps perpetuate these cultural practices, and there are others, but we'll maybe get to them in another time. But we tend to value the intellect over the emotions in this culture. That's primarily a male trait, and men started and are primary in perpetuating the cultural practices that deal with disrupting the relationship between infants and mothers. So regarding children, I would say if we could feel, we would know, and we would have more empathy for the child. Concerning something like corporal punishment, hitting children, try to get them to behave differently, this is something that's very common in this culture. 35% of infants are hit by caregivers or parents. About 90% of children 3 and 4 years old are hit, and this has very detrimental effects. But the point here is that if we could feel, we wouldn't need studies to tell us about the harm of corporal punishment and other practices. Our feelings would tell us. But since we're not feeling, and we tend to value the intellect over the emotions, then the intellect says, show me the study. That's the cultural value. That's how we tend to evaluate our behaviors, is let's look at the study and see what the study says. And you know what? Investigators can come up with any result they want from studies, and they do, and particularly on circumcision, because they're getting money for it. They have personal biases, they have cultural biases, religious biases, their own family history, for example. So the point is they can come up with any result they want, and there are specialists that go do meta-analyses of various studies, particularly in the medical literature, and they talk about these biases, and they speak at medical conferences and talk about these biases in the studies, and then the medical profession gets it and they understand it, and it continues because they say, well, that's other people, I'm doing fine. Okay, so there's that point. And then there's denial of need satisfaction. We have adopted beliefs, for example, that if we don't satisfy all our children's needs or some of our children's needs, they'll be more independent, they'll be less needy, they won't be spoiled, and actually the evidence is the reverse of this. If the children are not getting their needs met, they're more likely to have behavioral problems. And let me differentiate needs from wants. Needs are universal, and if they're not satisfied, there will be developmental consequences. Another one. We have implicit beliefs about children and infancy. For some adults and parents, it's as if the children were their property. So we sometimes deny children the respect they deserve, even though they're smaller and aren't as powerful as we are. They are human beings, and sometimes we ignore their autonomy. Sometimes we don't consider infants to be real people because we perceive they don't have some abilities that we do. But they are very capable. Newborn infants have been shown to have abilities of awareness, perception, sensitivity, responsiveness, purposeful movement, different facial expressions. They act rationally and have memory and learning. That's a lot. So let's give infants a little more credit for their humanness. And another belief we have is that what we do to infants doesn't really matter because they'll forget, they won't remember. And again, what I said before is that even though we may not remember in our minds, the body remembers. And here's another point here. Sometimes we refer to infants with the word it. And what can be more dehumanizing? We don't use that word for older children or adults. So that's a little bit about the beliefs and values that keep the practices going.
So what what would you focus on to pick one important cultural practice that we have in this country to make us start moving in a direction that you would, you want to see?
That's tough.
Yeah. Well, you got to start someplace.
Because okay. Well, let me give you, some other examples, just as mentioning them, and then if people want more information, they can contact me. My email is rg7846@gmail.com, and I can get them some more detailed information and even references. So I would include, let's have a natural birth, let's avoid circumcision, let's do better with breastfeeding, which of course is the natural way to nourish newborn infants. Actually, a lot of countries breastfeed up to the child is 2 or 3 years old. Let's have continuous body contact for infants. And including at night, not just during the day. Let's also have prudent use of non-maternal child care. Interesting fact in this country is that 56% of infants have mothers that work outside the home. So obviously they're not going to be together if the mothers are out working, So we have, cultural changes we need to make in order to support families and mothers. And again, I would say no corporal punishment. And again, we need more time to talk about those things specifically. But those are some starting principles of peace that could make a huge difference in how children feel and respond to others socially, both in young age and older ages. So we could ask ourselves, for example, with any child care choice, is this natural? If we trust and respect nature, we will not lose our own nature. Does this choice satisfy the child's needs? Certainly that has to be a a requirement to satisfy children's needs if they're going to have a healthy development. And does this choice satisfy the bond between the mother and child? When the bond between the child and the mother is disrupted, the bond between the child and humanity is disrupted. So let's do the best we can and educate ourselves. And if we do, we'll be more likely to have children's needs being met, a secure bond with the mother, higher self-esteem, and these children will grow to be more sensitive and empathetic and have less repressed anger and a decreased likelihood not only of violent behavior but of various psychological and social problems. So, we've got a lot of work ahead of us, and certainly with the Internet we have a wonderful tool of passing along this information to others and helping spread the word.
Indeed. I think you've outlined a really a good start. I think what this all means is if we just become more aware of the implications of some of our behaviors and the sensitivity that is required in keeping in mind the outcome if it's withheld, I think that this is something that as people become more aware of it, deeper changes and a deeper understanding of human behavior as it forms at a very early stage. And thanks to the work that you're doing and others, I think that will make a major contribution. We are coming to the end of the show now. I do want to let everyone know that Dr. Goldman's website is www.ronaldgoldmanphd.com. That's ronaldgoldmanphd.com. He also has a couple of links. You can find it on the show page where the link says upcoming shows. That it really is upcoming and past shows. I should change that. And a more detailed description of today's show is available, and his links are on that page. And so, actually, I want to give Dr. Goldman just one more word. If you have any references, any links, or you've already given your email, but anything else you want to say before we close?
Well, I want to quote a couple of people who have spoken about children. One is psychiatrist Carl Menninger, who said, "What's done to children, they will do to society." I think that's very meaningful and can help keep us on course. And then there was Gandhi, who said, "If we're to have real peace, we must begin with the children." So those of you out there who may not be having children yourself, you probably know somebody, friends or family, who will be having children in the future. So let's raise awareness and do better for the next generation, and we'll be on the road to a more peaceful society.
Yeah, here. And I must also mention that Gandhi said something very similar about our treatment of animals as well. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I want to thank Dr. Goldman, Dr. Ronald Goldman, for being a guest on my show. I hope you can come back sometime and talk some more about this.
I hope so, too. Thanks for the chance to speak with you.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. So this concludes tonight's broadcast. For links to my book, Ethical Empowerment, my philosophical counseling and hypnotherapy practice, and the Social Philosophizers Club, please visit arthurdschwartz.com. And this is Arthur D. Schwartz reminding you to live well and think deeply. Until next time, good night, everybody.